Okay, all right. Let's get started. Welcome all, and I'm sure we'll have some people adding in and joining as we go. My name is Anna Rubbo. I'm a board member of the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization and a researcher at Columbia University. So today it's my pleasure to welcome guests from around the world to this exciting event in Sydney. For those joining us for the first time, the CSU mission ranges from increasing awareness about emerging urban issues, facilitating knowledge transfer between and among policy and decision makers, and fostering cooperation while promoting the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and especially Goal 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities. CSU seeks to build bridges between the UN and civil society, the design professions, business, academia, and allied organisations. We're a non-profit volunteer organisation. In the spirit of collaboration, we would like to thank our program partners, including the UN Habitat New York office, the AIA New York chapter, the UN Habitat Professionals Forum, the NGO Committee on Sustainable Development New York, Columbia University's Center for Buildings, Infrastructure and Public Space, and the Creative Exchange Lab. We are grateful for their continued partnership in advancing this series. We invite everyone to visit CSU website, see our resources, publications, our past Green Cities talks, and this one will be recorded and posted, and join us for our 2026 events. In the lead up to UN Habitat's World Urban Forum in May, we are especially pleased to offer this session on housing. This year, the WOOF will focus on housing the world. The title is Housing the World, Safe and Resilient Cities and Communities, and it will shine a global spotlight on the urgent need to address the global housing crisis and position housing as a driver of inclusive, resilient, and sustainable urban development. I am joined here by our guest, New South Wales Government Architect, Abbie Galvin, who will address some of the solutions to the New South Wales housing crisis. Might the pattern book, which we're going to hear a lot about, offer a concept that can help address the housing crisis in other cities and regions, even perhaps New York? Now, before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we virtually meet today and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. Sydney was founded in 1788 by James Cook, and to Cook and the colonial and convict settlers, it was a terra nullius, an empty place. To the Darug, Darwal, and Eora peoples who lived on and cared for country for 60,000 years, it was anything but. Any of you who saw the Australian Pavilion at the 25 Venice Biennale, you would have seen Home, an installation curated by an Indigenous team which placed country and belonging at the centre of Australian values. Today, there is a growing awareness, including in design, education and practice, that Aboriginal knowledge and wisdom, especially with regard to land and climate change, holds a key to a sustainable future. Today, as in many cities around the world, there is also a housing crisis. So let me turn a little bit to the present and in Sydney. Sydney is a dynamic city, best known perhaps for the Sydney Opera House and its stunning Sydney Harbour. However, with a population of over 5 million, the city is beset by the high cost of housing, sprawl, traffic congestion, increasing income inequality, development pressures, and a race to keep ahead of climate change in a national economy buoyed by coal exports. The state of New South Wales is home to about 8.5 million people, demonstrating just how urbanised the state is when 5 million of us live in the city. To set the stage for today's conversation for non-Australian viewers, let's take a quick look at some quick facts that may help orient our audience. New South Wales is a very multicultural state, and social cohesion is high on the government agenda. 29% of the state's population were born in other countries. 50% have one parent born overseas. First Nations people represent around 4% of the state's population. Housing costs. Let's talk a little about housing costs. The median price for a house in Sydney is an eye-popping 1.6 million. The median rent is around $3,000 a month. The median income in Sydney is around $60,000, with an average salary of around $80,000. So do the math. Renters can easily pay over 30 and up to 50% of their income. Young people, essential workers, and low-income families especially face tremendous challenges in the housing market. Any of these metrics are more extreme for Indigenous Australians. As ANU demographer Liz Allen said in 21, Australia needs more people with lived experience of disadvantage in positions of leadership and power to undo the entrenched mechanics driving inequality in Australia. So, with that brief preamble, I wanted to now introduce our speaker and extend to her a very warm welcome. Abbie Galvin is the 24th New South Wales Government Architect, championing design quality across the state. She is the first woman to hold that position. Drawing on 30 years in architectural practice, she advances design excellence in public projects and contributes widely through writing, policy programs, research, and design advocacy. Her leadership spans civic projects, housing, and sustainability, continuing a 200-year legacy of design influence in public life. Abbie and her team's work include implementation of New South Wales' first sustainable building policy for non-residential buildings, leadership of the State Design Review Panel, and development of the New South Wales Book for Housing. She brings a particular interest in the meaning of home. I heard her talk about that recently, and I believe she is a marathon runner. So both attributes must serve her well in her efforts to address the housing crisis in New South Wales. Now, I know there'll be many questions for Abbie, so please use the chat function to submit your questions, and we will do our best to answer all. Abbie, the screen is yours. A very warm welcome. Over to you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Anna. Can everyone hear me and see my screen? Yep. You with me?
Good afternoon, Talia. This is Harvey Montague.
Okay, you can see my screen. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's wonderful to be able to have a talk to you today about some of the work we're doing. In Australia, as Anna said, it's respectful and traditional for us to acknowledge the owners of our land, who are the Aboriginal people. I'm here today on Gadigal land, and I pay my respect and show my appreciation for the ongoing care and respect that Aboriginal people have given to this place that we have a huge privilege of sharing together. They are the longest living culture on earth. And they live by the moniker of, if we care for country, she will care for us. And we have an enormous amount to learn from that statement. Just a little bit about the Government Architect's Office. This year we're 210 years old. I am the 24th Government Architect. And for 200 years, it was a more sort of traditional practice, designing and delivering public buildings. On its 200th year anniversary, it made a series of changes and became an office that was much more about strategy and advice and about being a good advocate within government. And I think it was an important shift. We have a really terrific private sector, and as the public sector, we need to be a very good client and a very good advocate. So all sorts of buildings have been delivered by the Government Architect, from the most simple schools, courthouses, police stations, through to some of our most grand, the train stations, galleries and majestic libraries. Our key purpose at Government Architect's Office is to realise public value through great design. So it is not design for design's sake, it's looking at what we can achieve out of that. We do a variety of different projects, as Anna said, from frameworks and positioning through to a lot of advocacy, advice within government, and we also deliver policy and guidance across government that then is applicable to the private sector too. I'll just use one of our research by design case studies in regard to housing. So we did a piece of work with a number of practices called Designing for Good Growth. And we selected 3 sites across Greater Sydney. One was a new release greenfield suburb, one was a high density transport oriented development, and one was an inner ring existing suburb. And our aim was to look at how we could use a medium density housing approach to improve and increase housing numbers, but to improve and increase amenity at the same time. Importantly, we worked with a land economist and quantity surveyors as we did this to make sure that all the moves we made were actually financially and feasibly achievable. So the first we did was the Greenfield subdivision. These are well known for big houses on small lots. They used to be big lots, but these days our lots are getting smaller, but the houses don't get any smaller. I think Anna might have spoken about the size of houses in Australia. We certainly have some of the biggest in the world. So by a small increase in the percentage of attached dwellings, and we didn't even go to apartments on this site, but we did a redesign of the master plan, we were able to achieve a 30% increase in dwellings, a huge increase in public parks and streets, and a reduction of walking distances to key train stations. So it was a really great example of how you can sort of adjust a few settings and make quite a big impact. We did the same thing for a transit-oriented development, which is typically a very small diameter of high-rise towers around a transit node. And we took an approach of saying, if we redesigned this using a maximum of 9-storey dwellings with 3 stories on the perimeter, how could we, again, get better amenity and better housing numbers? Again, this showed that we could get an increase of 30% in dwelling numbers over this small approach to towers just around a small perimeter. And then finally, we tackled a fairly difficult one, which was an existing suburb, existing inner ring suburb. And we did this one slightly differently. We focused on what we called place-based rezoning. We looked at particular sites, particularly end lots that were capable of upzoning, using, again, small apartments and medium density typologies. And what this indicated is if we were able to get an uplift of 10% of the lots, and they were very specifically chosen, that was able to yield 4,900 dwellings in this particular suburb, as well as increased tree canopy and amenity. So that then led on to some research that we commissioned from the University of New South Wales City Futures, which started looking at what people's preferences were when they're purchasing apartments. What is it that they are looking for? Not trying to move them from a house to an apartment, but if they're an apartment purchaser, what would they prefer? And what we were seeing was a huge preference for smaller apartment buildings, not moving into tall buildings with lots of amenity. We then put forward a proposition to create 2 definitions for mid-rise housing. One was low-rise, so manor homes, which is I think what you would in the US call a 4-pack, semis, terraces, and 2-storey residential flat buildings. And then we had a separate definition for mid-rise, because I think often when we talk about medium density housing, there's a confusion about what it actually means. So mid-rise was 3 to 6-storey residential flat buildings. So that very distinct definition made a big difference in how we could then think about policy. We also developed a website, which was an advocacy piece called Good Design for Housing, and we put out a request across industry, property industry, design industry to say, provide us great examples of mid-rise, low and mid-rise housing in your suburbs. And we developed a map across Sydney. It's a bit like a tourist map of saying, where are these spaces located? So it wasn't this is what it could be. It was a case of saying, this is what it is. We have so many of these types of dwellings in our suburbs already, and they don't impact your property prices. They won't reduce the quality and value of your neighbourhood and environment. They've actually been a part of our life and our living for a very long time. And that got an enormous amount of publicity and coverage at the time. That all then, as a whole package of work and advocacy over a period of time, led to the development of a new housing policy in New South Wales called the Low and the Mid-Rise Housing Policy, which essentially enabled particular suburbs that were well located to have low and mid-rise housing permissible in those areas. And then that led on to the pattern book, so building by the book. And our Premier in New South Wales was quite excited about the idea of a pattern book. It was something that he put forward. He wanted a design competition. I think whilst we talk about pattern books and different options and ideas for them, what a pattern book does do is it provides a very clear visual understanding of what something is, as opposed to a series of guides and controls, which is what planning controls are. And many people within politics and within our property industry were very enamoured by the notion and idea of the pattern book. He wanted to run an international design competition. He wanted the Government Architect's Office to lead it, and he wanted to bring the community along. So that led to the development of the New South Wales Housing Pattern Book. It was very much about accessing the Australian dream of property ownership, and our moniker ended up being simple, modest and affordable. So that was really the focus that drove us. It was about rediscovering the missing middle. We have so many different examples in our early suburbs of low and mid-rise housing. And this was a big part of that. We did some research that showed the implementation and impact pattern books had in New South Wales. For the first 100 years of the colony's development, 1800 to 1900, the majority of pattern books were English. They were brought to the shores by Mrs. Macquarie, and they were highly prized. They were, of course, not just for housing. They offered many different building types, but they were used very commonly for housing. By the 1900s, we began in New South Wales developing our own that became much more appropriate to climate and to building materials that were available and easy to access. There was a big post-war boom in pattern books, and ultimately they have very much been about democratising good design and enabling equitable access to good design. I'd say we have a lot of pattern books at the moment, which are greenfield housing developments. And we see the project home industry doing a lot of this, but it's this single detached housing. And our focus is about attached housing. So the most well-known example of pattern book development is the Sydney Terrace House. And you see these across many of our inner city suburbs and inner city suburbs across Australia. So there's a fair bit of research that actually demonstrates that people want to stay in the communities that they grow up in. They want to be able to have access to their families, to have good transport. And we have 3 million households in New South Wales, and 50% of those are either single people or couples without dependent children. So it's a pretty fundamental statistic when you look at some of our suburbs, which are big homes. So that lack of diversity for the housing we need is not present. We also know through the research from NSW that people prefer smaller building types. So when they're looking at apartments, there's a preference for buildings for 20 apartments or less, which is not what we tend to build. We tend to build much higher rise development because that's what we focus on zoning for. And as I said previously, that low and mid-rise housing policy was non-existent. So we developed 2 books, the low-rise pattern book and the mid-rise pattern book. We commissioned architects directly as government architect. 12 patterns were delivered in this way, and we also ran an international design competition, and 5 patterns were delivered through that. It was launched by the Premier. It had the backing of our planning minister, and it certainly had a lot of attention and publicity. And ultimately, it was about supporting the low and the mid-rise housing policies. So where housing types were permissible, you could use a pattern book design. And that's generally within 800 metres of goods and services, public transport and critical infrastructure. We focus very much on existing sites. So we did an analysis of typical suburban lots for semis, terraces, row homes and manor homes, and we had a number of adaptations. And we delivered 8 low-rise patterns. Again, they comprised of semi-detached homes, which is 2 on a single site, a manor home, which is 4, a row home, which is 4 homes, but it doesn't require a definition of a residential flat building, terrace houses, and there were 4 of those. So our focus was what the benefits of architect-designed housing were. We didn't talk about what something looked like. We spoke very much about energy efficiency, about flexibility, about ease of living in, affordability to construct, about diversity, so for everyone and every place, and really importantly, how they could be faster to deliver. I'll just run through a few examples. Terrace houses, again, energy efficiency, optimizing thermal performance, space for solar panels, water tanks, important to be able to purge heat, consider cross ventilation, managing sun, flexibility for different permissibilities. We had something called a low and a mid-rise housing area and a non-low and mid-rise housing area, which had different lot sizes that we worked with. We provided different material options for the dwellings, and they had different room types that you could swap in and swap out of the plans. And of course, a few plans that managed slope on a site and topography as well. And then diversity. So the manor home enabled a four apartment building that looks like as respectful as a single house in a suburb would, providing a greater level of access to different types of families. Easy to live in, lovely access to gardens and light. Affordability was a big part of it. We worked with quantity surveyors, and faster to deliver, so standardised sizes, considering what opportunities there were for modern methods of construction, modularisation, minimising spans, standardised components, etc. Then that led us on to the mid-rise housing pattern book, and mid-rise is quite distinct because it's a much more complex housing type. You push up into different building codes and different planning codes when you're looking at a residential flat building. So we had 9 mid-rise housing types, and ultimately they were about unlocking the small site. So we did a lot of work with our spatial services team within the Department of Planning, doing an analysis of all the different site types there were within areas where these homes were permissible. And what that demonstrated is only 13% of lots in these permissible suburbs were wider than 21 metres. And therefore, if you were to put an apartment building on a site, generally you would need to amalgamate lots, and we knew that would be a time impact. So we focused on looking at lots that were smaller, that were either 21 metres or smaller. So we developed small patterns, 3 to 16 metre wide lots, 16 to 21 metre wide, corner lots, and then we did look at a large lot that would be more considerate of a greenfield housing estate. So ultimately, those small buildings are about providing great amenity and capitalising on existing suburbs where that amenity is provided. There's a lot of complexity in designing an apartment building for a small lot, driveway crossings, waste, services provisioning, car parking, being able to achieve landscape and deep soil provisions as well. So ultimately, we worked very hard with the architects and a number of different consultants to try and solve these problems up front to make it much easier for an applicant. There was a level of adjustability considered in all of them about site boundaries, slight increases in width, how you could stretch buildings if site and lots changed. And we provided not only images and quality of external buildings, but of what the internal spaces were like. And they were all ultimately very considerate and respectful and simple buildings. The corner lot apartments offered a slightly different opportunity, where a corner lot generally is able to build to its boundaries, and it also offers a lot on a corner for community, retail, mixed use, etc. So there was a degree of flexibility in how you might crank or adjust some of the proportions of a corner lot. The apartments had always focused on great amenity and a lovely outlook, Some of them provided roof terraces if there wasn't communal space on a ground level. And they engaged with the community and capitalised on what a corner position could offer. And then there were large lot patterns. So this is, again, is for new growth areas where these sorts of master plans often focus on very large detached homes on very small blocks. And so this is looking at what might happen at an end lot if you were to put an apartment building on those. Again, we had 3 designs there. They were adaptable to suit different lot sizes, and they focused a little bit more on greater level of amenity, understanding that a number of people who are buying in greenfield subdivisions are looking for a single lot. So the decks and the terraces were sort of adequate and almost comparable to a garden or bigger. There was one of the designs that looked at 2-storey apartments, so they were much more like a home. They were ultimately a series of stacked terrace houses with individual entries off the street, lovely internal courtyards, and very expansive and generous balcony spaces. When we got into this project, it sounds like a simple thing, and ultimately you end up having to provide quite a lot of information to be able to make a proposition like this work. So when you purchase or download a pattern, you get an overview of what a pattern entails, so sort of an executive summary of the design. You get information to tell you what the requirements of the pattern are, like what you must meet, and then what you are able to adapt, so what you can't change and what you can. There's also a whole series of technical drawings that you can use for your planning submission and technical information. There's development standards that are put forward so that you know heights, floor space ratios, site coverage, etc. And we had a whole range of expert inputs, specialist engineers, structural, civil, acoustics, mechanical, our National Construction Code, fire engineering, sustainability, waste, traffic. There was a lot that ended up going into this of consultants that worked with our architects. When it came to the apartment buildings, we had to think a lot about waste and a lot about parking and traffic, a real complexity in New South Wales. And from speaking to a number of different groups across the US and Canada, I think you suffer similar things, but all of our local councils have different waste standards and different car parking standards. So this proposal was to have a standardised approach to waste and car parking for all of them. And we had quite considerable parking relaxations on the basis that they were all permissible in well-located areas. So there was a good access to transport. There was technical information in a guide that provides information on structural design, on environmentally sustainable design, and what the patterns have been designed to meet from an ESD perspective, and then fire safety engineering. And then, importantly, we worked with our planning department to create special planning pathways for these patterns so that you weren't subject to a council saying, no, I don't want that in our area. So for the low rise, it was a little bit easier because they're a simpler typology. And the planning teams created what was called a complying development code. So that doesn't actually require approval from a council. That can be done by a private certifier. So if you meet a pattern book design and you have a designer, either an architect or a building designer, this is for low rise, certify that you've met the requirements of a pattern, you're able to get an approval, and a 10-day approval was identified as being the preferred approach here. So you can go to a council, but you're able to get an approval by a certifier. Mid-rise was slightly more complex. However, we have a state environmental planning policy, which we call SEPs, and the housing SEP, which was in existence, had a new chapter created, and that chapter created a special provision for mid-rise developments. And it identifies where mid-rise development, where pattern books are permitted, and then it switched certain considerations off that council weren't allowed to consider. So there were only a number of limited things that councils were consider, and there were some adjustments made in our Environmental Protection Act about in the regulation to say that a design verification statement was required. So you had a fast-track planning process, still a development application, but a whole lot of considerations turned off, and you had to have an architect put your development together and sign a verification statement to say they have met the intent of the pattern. And we created a website for people to get started. That website provides access to all of the patterns, free downloadable PDFs. You could purchase computer drawings as well, and with those computer drawings, if you purchased a pattern, you would get a unique pattern identification number. So if you're putting an application in, you'd use that number to show that you'd purchased it, and what that meant was that you met the terms and conditions of the pattern. We have been working with a number of government agencies. Some of our agencies deliver housing. Homes New South Wales is public housing. Landcom is our state, essentially master plan developer, and Sydney Olympic Park as well. And we are looking at developing demonstration sites with those three agencies. And I think it was probably about 3 weeks ago now, and you can see a media article here. The first of those demonstration sites had a sod turned on the site, and one of the patterns is underway. So that's a series of terrace houses. It's a low-rise pattern, and it's a pattern of 7 terrace houses on this particular site using the new planning pathway. So we just launched the mid-rise patterns just at the end of the year, and 6 months before that we did the low-rise patterns. And this is just some statistics of the level of interest so far. There's been over 800,000 people have a look at the website. I think talking about housing and being able to look at housing options is of great interest to many people in New South Wales. There have been 85, in addition to 85,000 people just download packs of patterns to have a look at them. There have been over 24,000 patterns sold. Now, I'll just note that in that first 6 months, our Premier and Minister proposed to sell them for $1. So hence the sales just went through the roof, as you can imagine. And then so far, which has been sort of terrific to see, we've already had 26 applications go through the planning system for patterns, which I think in the end ends up being about 40 homes. We imagine mid-rise is going to take much longer. You know, planning processes, finding sites, doing your feasibility, etc., is not a quick task. So we're really delighted to see that some have started moving through the system. You can imagine we're on the phone straight away to those certifiers saying, "How did you find it? How's the process working? What can we do to try and adjust, make it easier, better, etc." There's been an enormous amount of media interest. Every major media outlet, be it television, news media, has covered the pattern book. It really seems to have shown a lot of interest across different people. And that is it. So I'm more than happy to take any questions, and really delighted to be able to take you through some of the work we've been doing. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Abbie, for such a comprehensive view on this very complicated program that has been put into place. I would very much like to take any questions from the audience. I'm just looking at the chat room. So could you start to populate the chat and send us some questions? I would like to sort of start off with a question, and especially since Australia is a sort of special case in as much as we're very used to a sort of a reasonably high standard of living and so on. But we do have tremendous stresses in our markets and for our population. And I was mentioning this a little bit. I mean, essential workers, the young who cannot get into the housing market, people on low incomes, and I would put into that sort of, the creative class. Is there, and again, I'm so interested sort of thinking about, our friends sitting in New York and thinking about these issues, where again, the challenges for all of these types of housing are tremendous. And I'm just wondering if you could sort of think sort of ruminate a little bit on does the pattern book offer ideas, options for sort of more low income housing that would be really good. I know, could we chat a little bit, if you could think about New York, perhaps? It's probably sort of spatially easier because it's on a grid and flatter, as you said. But anyway, if you could ruminate on that, because I think that is a question to me is, it's sort of amazing what's been done here. How does it translate? Can it translate? What are the big issues? I mean, you've obviously learned a lot by doing this as well.
So I think it can translate, Anna, and from the looking into the history of pattern books have been used since Vitruvius, so they're common. And of course, in the US, you've had catalogues. I think they're probably called catalogues more so than patterns. Sears and Roebuck's were, developing house patterns. And I think there's also work being done in Canada that's through your Housing and Mortgage Association. And interestingly, we found patterns that our New South Wales Savings Bank put forward in the 1930s, so that if you got a mortgage, you got a pattern at the same time, so that there was a level of low risk associated with taking a quality pattern design. So what this program offers is, when we talked about simple, modest and affordable, our focus has been simplicity in housing. So the designs are simple. The sizes are modest in size, particularly the low-rise. The apartments all meet a particular standard, but our low-rise homes, and I'd give you an example. The average size of a townhouse in New South Wales is 160 square metres, and we've reduced that quite significantly by about 40%. So it is still high amenity. It's still very effective as a home and a dwelling, but the sizes are much more modest. So therefore they become more affordable. So as well as the simplicity of construction, the size of them has been considered. And, we all know architects can be very clever when it comes to being able to design within those sorts of limits and constraints. When it comes to opportunity, we have many people who are sort of asset rich and cash poor, and that asset is often their home. So a process like this one, which is not just about putting property development into the hands of property developers, but an opportunity to have homeowners develop their own properties, so that you could take, and that's why our focus on the apartment building was also for a single lot rather than having to amalgamate lots. Was so that somebody who owns a home or owns a property might be able to develop it themselves. So you could own a house. It could still be a mortgage that you might have on it, and work with family members, extended family, friends to then develop that and use a pattern so that the process is made easier for you. So it was about trying to expand where property development can occur, to give people who would never have been in that position a greater opportunity, and therefore maximise the value of their land, or be a part of a process where somebody else might be able to might have the land and be looking at that. So as I said, extended families.
Right. Well, thanks very much for that. Just to pursue it a little bit, in this question of sort of very low income for housing the homeless and so on. And I think some of our New York viewers will know about the Cook Fox project in Queens, the Betances one, which I think has done a splendid job of really taking people who were living on the street and providing a very richly supported form of housing. And of course, in Australia, there's the example, which has been going for a long time, the work of Breathe and the Nightingale concept. And so in a way, they're sort of two opposite ends. But it does seem to me that the question of how does one start to do quality housing at reasonable cost in an efficient way for the most needy, and whether it's ownership or build to rent. And again, I would imagine probably in cities like New York, it's build to rent. And so thank you for enlarging on some of those questions. Now I'm looking at a couple of questions, which is good. Someone has asked, could you define terms such as manner, terrace types of housing for clarity. Yes, the use of the word manor is probably not familiar. Yeah.
Yes, so we have two classifications of building homes in New South Wales. One is called Class 1 and one is Class 2. Class 1 is generally a detached home or a home that's might be divided like a terrace house, but it's divided vertically. So you're not sitting horizontally on top of one another. And when you're divided vertically, it makes it a much cheaper build. You don't have all of the fire requirements that you do when you've got horizontal dwellings. So in a manor house is... Oh, are you still there? Yep. Sorry. Yeah. A manor house is essentially a residential flat building. It's a fourplex, so you get 2 up and 2 down. So it still requires a Class 2 construction, so it's a little bit more expensive. The terrace house is just a series of homes stacked vertically together. They're not on top of one another. And then a row home is where you have the front home reaching the street, and then you have 4 houses behind. And again, they're a bit like a terrace house, but turned 90 degrees to the street. So we've tried in low-rise, where possible, to have Class 1 dwellings because they're much cheaper to construct and don't have the same fire regulations. So a row home and a manor house. A row home is a Class 1, simpler construction, and a manor house is a Class 2, more complex construction. But they're both maximising the yield on a single lot, getting 4 dwellings from them. And then, of course, mid-rise is 3 to 6 story standard apartment buildings.
There was also a question from the same person, which was about energy variables and codes for the handicapped. I presume these meet all these?
They do. So we have a particular requirement with all of the pattern book homes to meet a certain energy standard, and they've all been designed to meet that standard, and then there's a requirement in the development standards that they do so. So we have something called a NatHERS rating, which impacts the thermal performance, and that's a 7-star average is what we're requiring there. There's water requirements as well, and energy requirements. So Green Star energy is being used. Cross ventilation is a big target. When it comes to accessibility, we have certain codes, and we have gone above that code from an accessibility perspective. So there's equitable access is above the standard in New South Wales for the pattern homes.
Okay, thank you. So we have another comment by Jane Katz saying, thank you. And what are the cost differentials for each type of housing that you discuss? I guess
that's that's a hard question to answer, and that's one we get from the politicians often, of what is the actual cost. What we were able to identify was the reduction in cost from the standard. So the cost planners looked at, if this was a typical townhouse cost, how does our townhouse or terrace house compare? Or if this is a typical apartment cost, how does ours compare? And we were able to make a number of fairly significant savings in the upfront costs. So one of the savings is about reduction of size of the home. One of the savings is about reduction of initial design fees. And one of the savings is reduction of time associated with planning and holding costs. And so we varied between a sort of a 10 to a 15% reduction in the overall cost of a home of each of the typologies.
Wow, that's compelling. That's very compelling. Thank you for that. Another question is, are you specifying or defining specific sustainability actions or materials?
So we are defining particular sustainability actions. There's certain requirements, as I said, from an energy, a water and a thermal perspective that all the developments are required to meet. And the designs, now this is an important sort of qualification, is that the development of the design is to take it to a development application stage. We don't provide documentation for building. So somebody still has to develop the design further to enable a builder to price and build it. So we have designed at the level of drawing that we provide it to meet a particular sustainability standard, and then there's a requirement as they build the development to maintain that standard. So both design and construction.
Okay, thank you. Okay, another question goes to the single family house. And the question is, do the patterns consider single dweller housing with changing demographics, especially aging, I suppose, means that many houses that accommodated whole families now only have one resident. And that obviously is contributing to the current shortage. Is that an area that you have addressed?
We haven't addressed what might happen to a single home. And the reason we haven't addressed that is it's very hard to predict it. So a pattern is about putting a design forward for an empty site as opposed to taking a home and being able to adapt that home. So it needs a fairly sort of specific design response to it that is very hard to predict. That being said, planning policy has considered the ability to create a semi on a site. So if you do that via a new building, or if you do that via an existing home, there's a greater level of opportunity now. So every single detached home site in New South Wales can now be a semi-detached, as I said, either converting an existing or providing new. So it was a pretty fundamental planning change.
Mm-hmm. Just a follow up to that question, significant numbers of amount of housing stock must be in that category, and yet as the cost of building, cost of renovations is so very, very high, probably the owners of these sorts of properties are really not in a position to do that effectively. That would be my assessment. And so is there an opportunity, maybe not for the Government Architect's Office, but for some organisation to really look at this one particular, it might be effectively addressed, how it might be financed, and those sort of things? Could you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I do, and it's a great thing to raise. There has been, and you might like to do a search of it, a proposal put forward called Bluefield Housing by Damien Madigan in South Australia. And that does exactly that. That looks at how you can convert existing homes as well as add on to the home to capitalise on the infrastructure that's there and to increase the housing numbers. So it's a really terrific piece of work.
Oh, excellent, excellent.
And in South Australia, it's particularly effective because the lots are generally bigger than they are in New South Wales, as are the homes. And my two brothers live in exactly that condition, one in a converted house with my parents and the other in a converted house with his in-law aunt and uncle and their respective families. So it's a great model.
The ADU or the granny flat has also sort of been a way of dealing with the larger lot. But just the number of houses, especially in inner city areas, urban areas, that would be open to that would be quite interesting, I think. Yeah. Thanks. That's fantastic. So we have another question here is, says, excellent presentation, Abbie. Thank you. Of the 26 pattern developments that have progressed to date through the planning phase, have they had a cost of works accompany their application? And if so, are you finding the cost of construction affordable in today's standards for New South Wales?
That is an excellent question, and we haven't been reviewing the cost of work. So thank you for raising that one. We'll certainly do so.
Okay, great. Another question is, what is the level of public participation in urban policies?
Now, that's an interesting question. I think you probably get a very varied answer, and I'm sure there's a sort of a consistency across the world in this. But previously, participation had generally been about from those who are concerned and are protesting about urban policy. And what we've increasingly seen is those who are advocating for change in urban policy. So we have local council meetings for each of the local councils as they're looking at their approvals, where residents are able to be a part of a response. Now, that generally is once an application is put forward. If there's changes in the strategic plan, that is also publicly exhibited. So there's community participation that is enabled through our Planning Act. And what we're beginning to see, as I said, is a much greater emphasis on those who are advocating for change rather than those who are trying to prevent change. So the conversations are becoming a lot more nuanced and sort of development and equity focused, I think, rather than let's not change focused. But yes, our Planning Act bakes in requirements for community consultation. I think there would be many people who probably debate whether it's done well.
It's hard to do.
Yeah, I just highlight an interesting one that has been done recently by our Inner West Council, and they have released quite a significant new planning strategy, and they put a big focus on community consultation. They had sort of sliding images that showed existing and new. They did everything they could to be able to try and describe to the community in visuals what the changes were, because any level of change in planning is very hard to understand and penetrate if you're not a planner. How do you understand what a code and control means? You go from an R2 to an R3 to an R4, floor space ratios, heights of development, zones. It's a different language, whereas Inner West Council looked at a lot of visuals to help people understand what they were proposing. It's a one worth having a look at.
Very good, very good. So I think we have one question here, which is, have you considered solutions to avoid homogeneity? And I think there's a bit of a tag to this question, which is by the use of AI in design.
Oh, okay. I thought it was more about cookie-cutter development.
You might think of another tag.
Okay, so AI has been furthest from our mind and our work in the development of these patterns. They're all developed by very capable and experienced architects who really thought very carefully about the development and design of their patterns. We had a lot of community, particularly at the beginning of the project, before the patterns were released, saying they didn't want cookie cutter designs, they didn't want cookie cutter suburbs. And my response to that was, if cookie cutter is done well, it can be beautiful. And so many of our suburbs around the world, where there's repetition and beautiful repetition, are highly successful, visited, treasured, and valued. And if we were in a situation with our pattern book where there were so many patterns being used that we were being accused of cookie cutter, I think we'd sort of say we've actually probably done a good job that we've got so many patterns out there. However, I think ultimately the numbers will be quite different, and the aim is not for huge suburbs. It's about infill development. So it's unlikely we'll get an enormous amount of repetition. But that being said, they've been designed to be repetitive if they were to be used in greenfield suburbs, and I think they work very well as repetitive elements, just like our terrace houses do.
And brownstones in New York, for instance.
Yeah, exactly.
So it does seem to me that one of the big sort of innovations in the old pattern book is the consideration of the landscape. And I know that there were landscape consultants and so on. And I think that's a really important thing, that, sort of architecture tends to focus on the building rather than the landscape or the urban context. So it does seem to me to be a big plus. I have, I think, one last question for you.
And I might just say, Anna, we actually put a landscape guide out as well. And I'm sorry I didn't reference that, but as well as the patterns, there was the landscape guide. So you're able to use that landscape guide alongside your pattern design.
And as I understand it, it focuses on biodiversity, it focuses on native plants, and so it's a sort of whole of environment approach through the landscape. Yeah.
That's right. And as many permeable surfaces as possible on sites that have a lot of building on them. And it also provides planting pallets for a diversity of climate zones, which we have a huge diversity in New South Wales.
Right. So I've got two questions for you. One is, has there been pushback from architects who say you're going to take away a key part of our ability to function productively in our society because you're going to have all these, not cookie cutter, but similar designs? Yeah, I guess that would be a question I would be interested in hearing you address.
Yeah, and it definitely was one that was raised with the industry and the Institute of Architects very early. So firstly, low-rise pattern types don't require architects to design them. And a very, very small percentage of the homes in New South Wales are designed by architects. So this is a way of having architects engaged in a design process for housing types that they wouldn't ordinarily be involved in. As a government, we have paid for the pattern that the architect has developed, and we've also paid a license fee for the ongoing use, which the architects charged us to ensure that they are given compensation for how often it is used. So, as I said, low-rise, architects aren't in that domain, and it enables architects to be in that domain. Part of the requirement, though, is that if you're taking a pattern, you need an architect or a building designer to put your application in and develop it. So it actually bakes into the planning system that you still need a designer of some kind. With mid-rise, it's only the first step of the design and the application that has been developed, and then you are required to have an architect to tailor that pattern to your site and to put your application in and to develop the project. So again, that is baked into the planning application. So it's not taking architects out of the picture, it's actually baking them in by the planning requirements. And I think too, we worked a lot with the Institute and the industry in looking at the history of pattern books and how they have absolutely been led through history by architects as being able to get a greater level of design quality, as I said, democratizing design for a broader amount of the community.
Good. Well, we're nearly out of time. There is one extra question, which is, will you add social infrastructure necessary to convert housing into a livable community, daycare, public space, retail, etc.?
Yeah. So when the low and mid-rise housing policy was determined, that was very specifically hand-chosen for areas that where that type of housing could be permissible after having done assessments of the infrastructure that was there. So it's not just a blanket everywhere in New South Wales. The planning teams quite carefully chose what was considered well located and had good infrastructure already. That being said, we have a process of infrastructure contributions when developments are put forward, and those infrastructure contributions are also going toward building additional infrastructure in a suburb and a neighbourhood.
Good.
And I'm not sure what anyone else is sort of seeing, but certainly in New South Wales, what we're seeing in inner city suburbs is infrastructure like schools are reducing in their population and use, because we've got sort of smaller households in bigger homes because children are moving further and further out. So we almost have the reverse issue of some of that social infrastructure. It's not being used enough now.
Lots of moving parts. Well, with that, I would like to bring the session to a close and would like to thank Abbie enormously for her time, and for all of you out there who have just thrown up some terrific questions and making us all think freshly. And I do hope, just from my interest in CSU as a New York-based organization, to know whether this conversation might go further in New York. And I would be extremely, extremely interested to see whether Abbie does indeed take the pattern book idea to the World Urban Forum in Baku in May, and to see what sort of reception, what sort of adaptation. I think we're all sort of concerned about the bottom sort of rungs of all this, the low income, the people who who don't access housing easily, and how can we make more equitable, generous, and dynamic places for living. So Abbie, thank you so much. It's been an absolute treat. And for anybody who missed this, whose friends missed it, it will be up online very shortly. So thank you, and bye-bye, everybody. And thank you, Abbie.
Great. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your interest.